One giant leap for mankind.
Welcome to a World News Special to mark 30 years since Apollo 11 blasted off from Cape Canaveral in Florida. As we approach the millennium, it's a time to reflect on a space mission that helped define the achievements of a century of progress, man's first landing on the moon. It was a full 4 days after blast-off that Neil Armstrong was finally able to clamber down the steps of the lunar module onto the surface of the moon and utter the now historic words, "It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." In a few moments, we'll be going live to the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral in Florida, where Neil Armstrong, together with Buzz Aldrin, who accompanied him onto the surface of the moon, are to address a news conference. But with me first, Philip Clark, a spaceflight consultant. I see one of the astronauts is calling it the greatest single human endeavor in the history of mankind. I suppose arguably it was.
Yes, the first flight of anyone from Earth to another world has got to be a monumental achievement, and that's what we had with Apollo 11. The problem was that the earlier Apollo flights had gone so smoothly. Apollo 8 around the moon, Apollo 10, the dress rehearsal, that Apollo 11 looked oh so easy. And back on Earth, we didn't really get the feeling of all the technology that, quite honestly, could have gone wrong.
As a space enthusiast, I mean, most people can remember where they were 30 years ago, but as a space enthusiast 30 years ago, I mean, you must have been beyond yourself with excitement.
Oh, yes. When NASA announced in January 1969 that they were going to try and put men on the moon with Apollo 11, and they were going to be launching in mid-July, I was then working in a building society, and I immediately went and booked my 2 weeks annual holiday for July. And I spent the whole of those 2 weeks sitting in front of the television watching Apollo 11. Other people were going to places like Blackpool or other holiday resorts. I went to the moon.
Now, tell us about the two astronauts we're going to see. Neil Armstrong, something of a reclusive character, wasn't he?
Yes, he and Buzz Aldrin are very different kinds of people. Armstrong is very much, as you say, a reclusive guy, an academic, but on his first space flight, which was Gemini 8, it was the first time that the Americans had a real emergency in space where the spacecraft was tumbling out of control. Neil Armstrong was the mission commander. He was the man who brought it under control, and he was the man that brought the spacecraft back to Earth safely.
Now, when we see them in a few moments, obviously they're going to be 30 years older. What have they been doing for the past 30 years, the pair of them?
Neil Armstrong has retired from public life and is a professor of astronautics and engineering. Buzz Aldrin is still very active on the spaceflight scene as a businessman, as a consultant, as a writer, as somebody who's happy to go around lecturing on the subject, and is well known for very futuristic ideas about how we should go back to the moon and how eventually we should fly to Mars.
Philip, for the moment, thank you. Let's go now live to Washington and our correspondent there, Rob Watson. Well, how is America celebrating this great event 30 years on, Rob?
Well, they've been celebrating by reading all the specials that there are in all of the newspapers, of course, and all of the magazines. And, of course, American television, which is a never very shy institution, has certainly been reminding everyone of the anniversary. There have been stories all over the various networks, and I think we're going to see plenty more of them in the days ahead.
It really captured the world's attention. There's been nothing like it since. What is NASA up to these days? What are they planning to try and win back public attention?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's very difficult. It's when you think back to just how spectacular those achievements were 30 years ago, with the slightly more modest achievements these days, putting technology into space, building a space lab, not quite the same. of course, you could argue that anything was going to seem a little bit tame after landing men on the moon. But the kind of projects that they're involved in, as this joint project with the Russians to build a new space station, there was, of course, a telescope. There have been talk about sending a mission to Mars, but not, of course, the heady days of the late 60s.
And NASA's been complaining, has it not, in recent years, that it's starved of funds compared to the old days?
I think that's a fascinating point to bring up. When I was looking through some of the facts and figures of the research at the time, the Apollo program cost the equivalent of $120 billion of US money in today's money. And of course, at the time, many people were saying, well, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Nixon, what on earth are you doing, spending $120 billion when we have poverty in our inner cities? I think if you were to have an equivalent budget today, it would be extraordinary.
That is a phenomenal figure, $120 billion. But of course, it was more than just a race to the moon. It was a space race, wasn't it? And they had to beat the Russians.
Absolutely. This again, now that the Cold War is over, is something that it's difficult to remember. But if you think back, President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, who took over from President Kennedy, it was interesting. One of the things that strikes home at me, when the Russians beat the Americans into space initially at the end of the 50s, putting a satellite, a Sputnik up there, President Johnson is said to have looked at the skies and said, space now seems like an alien place. The race to the moon was very, very much part of the Cold War. The Americans, after falling behind the Russians with Sputnik and getting the first rocket in space, were determined not to allow that happen. And in many ways, the landing on the moon was part of the Cold War victory, the victory of capitalism over communism.
So looking back 30 years, how does America see the achievement of what those men did? Is it strictly in scientific terms now, or is it valued for other reasons?
I think it's valued for a variety of complex reasons. I think, of course, yes, a scientific achievement, yes, a political achievement, but I think most of all, and I think this is reflected in Hollywood, Americans love a good drama. They love a spectacular adventure, men fighting against adversity, and then there being perhaps the end not being entirely straightforward, but you get there, you have a happy ending. I think that is part of what Apollo is about. Let's not forget, of course, that a film was made about one of the Apollo missions. It was a great success. It's the drama, it's the adventure, the tough journey to a happy ending that I think really appeals to Americans.
Rob Watson in Washington, thank you. And we'll be going live to Cape Canaveral when that news conference with the original astronauts takes place, and we're expecting that to start any moment now. But for the moment, Susan Flory looks back to July 1969 and the space mission hailed as one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century.
From their crew quarters here at the Kennedy Space
Astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins on their way to the launch pad at the Cape 30 years ago, and an historic lunar landing that would put the Americans out of reach in the space race with the Soviet Union. Now, with shuttle missions routine, the focus is on technology, but in 1969, geopolitics drove the project that put the first man on the moon.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
On launch day, more than 1 million people lined Florida's beaches and causeways to see Saturn V, the largest launch vehicle ever made, rocket into space. As Collins circled the moon in the mothership, Aldrin and Armstrong sped toward its surface in a lunar lander called the Eagle. The computer navigation system had them on target to crash into a field of boulders when Armstrong took over, flying the Eagle like a helicopter, landing it in a clearing, the Sea of Tranquility, with only 15 seconds of fuel left.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Nearly 8 hours later, equipment checks made, Neil Armstrong made the first human footprints on the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful from here, Neil. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here.
Hello, Neil and Buzz.
Buzz Aldrin became the second man.
Well, I'm sorry, we've got some technical problems there. With me now is Philip Clark, still a spaceflight consultant. I was getting quite engrossed in that. I mean, it is so evocative. It brings it all back, doesn't it? And that wonderful small step for man, a giant leap for mankind. It can't have been spontaneous.
There are reports, well, first of all, Neil Armstrong has always said that for him it wasn't really that much of a big deal. And there are some reports that the phrase was actually put together by his wife.
But it is a very memorable line, isn't it? I would have thought,
yes,
didn't NASA prime him for it?
It's very memorable, although grammatical purists tear out their hair in horror.
It doesn't come into it, though. It just had a certain symmetry, didn't it?
Oh, yes,
and it just summed up the achievement. What about the achievements? I mean, they went there and collected some rocks, did they not? Did that turn out to have any lasting significance?
In a scientific sense, yes, it did. And in fact, only a small proportion of the lunar rocks have actually been analysed, even now, 30 years after the event. Most of them are still kept in storage for study by future academics. And we're still getting new photographs being released by NASA from Apollo 11 and subsequent lunar missions, simply because so much material, so many photographs were taken that it was impossible to release everything at the time.
Now, what if things had gone wrong with that mission? I think the American archives were opened up only, was it last week, to reveal what would have happened. President Nixon would have made an address to the nation and so on. And the astronauts, the two of them, would have been left, wouldn't they? Marooned on the moon to either commit suicide or to die.
Yes. I mean, this is something that those of us who followed the program knew what the situation was, and we assumed that NASA and the White House would have made these contingency plans, even going as far back as Alan Shepard's first flight in 1961. And there must be similar plans for the current space shuttle missions, that if anything goes wrong, certain speeches will be made, etc. But to counter what would have happened if things had gone wrong, NASA made sure that the engine on the ascent stage of the lunar module that would have taken the crew off the lunar surface was the most reliable engine that they had built.
Philip, let's go live now to Cape Canaveral. The astronauts are there at last, a few minutes late, but there they are. We can see them in profile there, sitting on some stools in front of the gathered press. So going back to, you know, the worst case scenario up there, they didn't have pills with them then that would have taken their lives.
It's always been denied, both by the astronauts and by NASA, that they had pills or any suicide system. They could have either chosen a slow death as air ran out, or alternatively, I think the most likely thing is that they would simply have done a rapid depressurization of the lunar module and died by asphyxiation in a matter of seconds.
Because it was a thought that was going through all our minds, wasn't it, as we watched? What if this goes wrong? I mean, that's what made it partly so exciting, wasn't it?
Yes. Since the story appeared last week, something that has been going through my mind is how the astronaut who was the Capcom, the controller between Houston and the astronauts, how he would have felt, because the instructions were that he would close the link to the lunar module so that the crew could then decide what they wanted to do, and we would not know on Earth.
Philip, for the moment, thanks. Let's go and hear what the astronauts have got to say for themselves.
There were 11 piloted Apollo missions between 1968 and 1972, 6 of which landed on the moon. 12 humans have spent 57 hours walking on the moon and brought back to Earth 852 pounds of lunar samples. Today, we are joined by 4 of the Apollo astronauts. And from your left to right, we have Neil Armstrong, Apollo 11 spacecraft commander, and of course the first human to set foot on the moon. Buzz Aldrin, Apollo 11 lunar module pilot, the second human to set foot on the moon. Eugene Cernan, lunar module pilot on Apollo 10, which came within 50,000 feet of the surface of the moon as a dress rehearsal for Apollo 11, but he didn't miss out. Mr. Cernan became the last man on the moon in 1972 as the commander of Apollo 17. And we have Walt Cunningham, the pilot of Apollo 7, the first manned Apollo flight launched in 1968. These gentlemen have kindly agreed to make themselves available today as we celebrate the 30th anniversary of Apollo 11. We're going to take about 25 to 30 minutes of questions. Please identify yourself by name and agency and wait for me to call on you. And if you would, please direct your question to a specific individual. And we'll start with Marcia Dunn of Associated Press. Go ahead and talk.
Mr. Armstrong, many would agree that you gave the most eloquent and enduring speech when you stepped onto the moon. And I'd like if you could share with us how and when did you compose For One Small Step? And could you settle it for once and for all? Was there an A before the word man?
I didn't think about that until after landing. But after landing, actually, having been somewhat surprised the fact that we were able to make a successful touchdown, I realized I was going to have to say something. But there wasn't anything very complicated when you just think about stepping off, why it seemed to follow. The A was intended, I thought I said, I can't hear it when I listen on the radio reception here on Earth, so I'll be happy if you just put it in parentheses.
Bill Harwood, CBS News.
Another question for Mr. Armstrong. Chris Pratt, flight director in Houston for so many years, once likened the Apollo program to the pyramid of the 20th century. And I was wondering, when you look back on this, when you put Apollo 11 in the context of the program, how do you view the significance of that program and your landing on the moon and of course it being your district?
I'm not sure I understood the question.
Summarize that again, Bill.
Yeah, Chris Pratt once said that Apollo 11 getting to the moon successfully symbolized the equivalent of the pyramids of the 20th century, and I was wondering how you view the significance of your flight in the historical context.
Well, in the sense that the objective was achieved by the contribution of a lot of blocks underneath it, that's certainly true, because each flight did as about equal contribution to the progress of the program as a whole, and actually, as the flights went on beyond 11, I think they got increasingly efficient in gathering more information and more science. So probably the flights after 11 were more scientifically rewarding, but 11 happened to be the one that the president had enunciated, and so we got a lot of ink for that.
Okay, we'll take a question on the other side of the room. Miles O'Brien at CNN.
Mr. Armstrong, you're a very private person, relish your privacy. Have you ever, over the years since your landing, wished you could have traded that opportunity to be the first to land on the moon for the opportunity to lead a life with fewer public demands?
Never.
Jim Slade in the very back. Jim?
Jim Slade, ABC. Neil, we've asked the same question to the other three gentlemen there with you, and I'd like to hear your opinion. Is there a compelling reason for this country to go back to the moon?
There's a compelling reason for society to go back to the moon. That case will not be made by me or any of us here, actually. It's being made by scientists and technologists around the world who are developing increasingly better reasons to go back.
Are you disappointed that we have not been back as a society or otherwise?
Yeah, I left a few things up there.
Tony Whitten at AP Radio.
Mr. Armstrong, the question very much along the similar lines. Do you regret or are saddened by the fact that there's a whole generation of school children for whom your entire mission is nothing more than just a picture in a history textbook, that there isn't anything currently planned beyond just going around an Earth orbit?
Well, I guess all of us would like to see more things going on than are going on, more new starts. We'd like to be doing more, but the kids, I find, are pretty enthusiastic about what we did. The regret on our side is that they used to, some years ago, they used to say, we were reading about you in science class, and then it was, we were reading about you in history class, and now I think it's early American history.
Okay,
the fact that all you people are here seems to me to make it a good bit more than just a picture in the history book.
There's someone in the middle over here from Ohio, the blue shirt.
Cincinnati Inquirer. Your great words about one giant leap for mankind 30 years ago. Now, looking back, what would you say should be, and looking forward, I should say, what would be the next great leap for mankind?
Well, the nearest one coming up may be Chandra, if it launches Tuesday? Mm-hmm. Tuesday, I think. That might be the next one. Certainly the International Space Station is one. If I were to pick one that was important to me, it would be going to Mars.
Okay, we'll take a question. Mike Cabbage, Orlando Sentinel over here.
My question is for Mr. Armstrong also. On Tuesday morning, Eileen Collins is scheduled to become the first woman to fly the space shuttle. Do you think this is something that's been too long in coming, and do you think women should have been allowed to command missions back in, say, the Gemini and Apollo missions?
Well, we didn't have anybody in our cadre at that time. We didn't have any ladies in our cadre, so it wasn't a choice that was available to us. From everything I've heard, Eileen Collins is a very well qualified, very experienced, very able commander, and I'm sure she'll do just a superb job.
Okay, questions here? Let's see. There's one right there.
Mr. Armstrong, most of us were here last October when John Glenn returned to orbit. If Dan Golden called me in the morning and said he was ready to tank up another Saturn V, would you take the right?
He'd have a lot of competition against her, I'll tell you what. I don't know what his answer is, but he's going to have to run fast to the pad.
We're younger and maybe tougher.
I think you're right. I think it'd be a race. I don't think he's going to give me that question. He'll probably say you have to be 80 to go, and so maybe we'll talk again.
There's a question here, the local Florida Today newspaper.
My question is also for Mr. Armstrong. I guess most of our questions are for you because you're the person we probably heard from the least over the years. My question is, how have you balanced privacy and perhaps the obligations of history that so many people do want to know your thoughts, do want to know your recollections for history, but then your desire for privacy? How have you balanced that?
Well, from my perspective, I've shared those thoughts a great deal over the past 30 years in many forums, and a lot of press conferences over the years, and a lot of interviews with historians and technical writers, and really quite a few press conferences. So I think I probably already said more than I have up here.
Okay, let's see.
Well, there we go. That was Neil Armstrong dominating proceedings there at the Cape Canaveral News Conference, understandably so, because he doesn't often talk to the news media. They're continually badgering him for interviews, and he doesn't give them. He said, as you probably heard, that was a spontaneous quote, the one we were talking about earlier, and the one we all know so well about the small step for man and the giant leap for mankind. And I thought it was quite interesting, Philip, that he was asked if he was disappointed there'd been no recent manned flights to the moon. He said, yes, I left a few things up there.
Yes, all of the Apollo crews took something to leave up there. And in fact, something that the Apollo 11 crew took was for what they referred to as fallen astronauts, which were medallions for American astronauts and also Russian cosmonauts who had died. Some medallion or other commemorative item was left on the lunar surface for them.
Now, he's a very reclusive character, Neil Armstrong, but he looks quite a genial fellow. I mean, I just read something about on a recent trip to Cape Canaveral, he'd refused to sign autographs when some of the NASA workers had asked him to sign, a photograph or something like that.
Yes, it was asked right at the end about this balance between his private life and his obligations. Now, yes, he has done interviews with the press and with historians, but they've always been very carefully chosen and carefully managed interviews. And of the Apollo 11 crew, he's the only one not to have published either an autobiography or to have had an authorised biography.
Why not? Why not?
I think it is simply that he is a very private person. That's something that was known by NASA before he was assigned as the Apollo 11 mission commander.
But don't you really want a team player when you're sending a group of men to the moon?
Oh, he is very much a team player. He was a very professional astronaut. It was one of the best that NASA had. It's simply that in terms of public relations, he's always been very reclusive.
Philip Clark, thank you very much. Let me leave you with the final thought from Michael Collins, who of course circled the moon, with the man we haven't heard from. He said, as the time passed, I've come to understand that the true value of Apollo wasn't the rocks, wasn't the data that we brought back, it was the worldwide sense of participation of people everywhere, recalling where they were at that moment and how they shared in a human adventure that brought out the best in all of us.
These men are members of the most exclusive club in the world. That of the 12 who have walked history. Who will take mankind to Mars? From the technological triumph that conquered the moon, to the pursuit of Mars through extraordinary feats of human endurance. Celebrate space exploration with one small step throughout July on BBC World.
The Smart Minute is sponsored by ABB.